And what I'm going to try to do is try to encourage you to be so frightened and scared that you will run out into the world and try to get this balanced budget amendment resolution passed. How many folks are from Florida here? Hey, my state, my home state of Florida, had the wisdom back in 2010 to place on our general election ballot this straw question. Should the Constitution be amended to require a balanced federal budget without raising taxes? With more than 5 million votes cast, 72% of Floridians said yes, and with justification. They are afraid of the future, the fiscal future of our nation, just as much as we are in this room. In October of 2013, roughly October 1st, Congress bragged that the deficit that they had that fiscal year was the smallest they had had in 5 years. It was $719 billion, and it was the 5th highest in history. Now remember, we had the spending freeze at that time, that we had shut down government for a while. Well, they also anticipated that and had to sandbag spending. However, Congress caught up. For the first 6 months of this year, 2014, the national debt increased $863 billion. In fact, the month of October, they borrowed more than $400 billion. Today, roughly the national debt stands at some $17,600 billion. This is more money than all the debt of all the European Union nations combined, and is greater than our gross national product. And the last time our national product the debt was greater than our gross national product was during World War II. And that has been the only time in the history of our country where our national debt has been the size of our economy. I need to explain to you the problems we're going to have with this borrowing and this debt, because it can reach crisis proportion in a very short period of time. And it comes from where the money we are borrowing. This graph shows us the anticipated deficits that we're going to have through the year 2020. Congress literally plans on borrowing another $7 trillion by 2020 or 2021. These are that 1 year that we allegedly had a balanced budget, but after we accounted for the interest due on the previous debt, the national debt actually increased. But let's take a look from where we borrow our money to fund this deficit in the current debt. Because this is the root of the major problem we're going to face as a nation. We borrow from two places: from the public, which is domestic and foreign entities, and from our trust funds, the trust funds that our country has set up. Now, if you're familiar with trust funds, if you're a legislature, the federal government has several of those. The largest is the Social Security Trust Fund. They have dedicated taxes, the money goes in the trust fund, and they're only legally allowed to spend the money on the purpose of that trust fund. They have the Highway Trust Fund, the Social Security Trust Fund, Medicare Trust Fund. Well, that has been a tremendous source of money and cash available to fund our debt. This graph shows us the surpluses in the Social Security Trust Fund from roughly 1980 through 2014. This is when the Congress virtually doubled the Social Security tax, when George Herbert Walker Bush and Congress joined together to double the tax. Look at these huge, massive surpluses reaching $180 billion a year of cash that went into the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, I remember the press conference when they announced this massive tax increase. They said this is going to throw off surpluses, that money's going to go into a bank, and then we'll have enough money to pay for Social Security to the year 2040 because of all the surpluses that we're going to have. And the American people said, okay. Well, those surpluses came in very handy, except that Congress has borrowed the money from every trust fund that they have. The Social Security Trust Fund is now owed $2.7 trillion. The Civil Service Retirement Pension Program has been looted and is owed $821 billion. The Military Pension and Retirement Program is owed $868 billion, and on and on and on and on. All of this money will have to be repaid. And in the case of Social Security, that's going to begin in 3 or 4 years. So we ask the question, from where does the money come to fund the deficits? During this period of time, between 2002 and 2008, deficits totaled $3.3 trillion. Well, let's go back to Social Security. Remember those huge deficit or surpluses that we had? To help fund that, 36% of the deficit was financed by Social Security. 54% was funded by foreign entities. And that is a relatively new thing for the federal government to reach out outside of our shores to borrow money. Now, we've all heard about it. Japan and China are our two biggest lenders. Over this period of time combined, they loaned us about $1.5 trillion, and they were handsomely rewarded for it. Not in interest payments, but in favorable trade policies. Let me explain. When we sell something to another nation, we'd like to have them buy our goods, and we buy their goods. If a nation buys $1 worth of goods, we'd like to have them buy $1 worth of goods. For the last 25 years, Japan has enjoyed a $1 to $2.50 trade ratio. For every dollar they buy from us, we buy $2.50 of their products. Beginning in roughly the year 2000, China had not been loaning us money. Over that period of time, they loaned us about $900 billion. Were they handsomely rewarded? So far this century, for every dollar they buy of our goods, we buy $5 of theirs. No nation state would ever tolerate those trade imbalances unless they have to. And we have to because they have to loan us money to fund our government. So let's continue. Between 2009 and 2013, deficits totaled $6.3 trillion, twice as much as we had before. From where did that money come from? Well, the Social Security Trust Fund isn't throwing off the surpluses like it used to because baby boomers are retiring. There's more money going out. The money just isn't available. In fact, by 2015, we're not going to have surpluses, and payment to that fund is going to have to begin. So at that time, only 6% of this deficit was funded by Social Security. Foreign entities dropped to 40%. During this period of time, China and Japan only loaned us about half as much money as they used to. In fact, most of the nations now are beginning to think the foreign nations are cutting back on how much they're willing to give us. 38% came from the Federal Reserve Bank. And that had a significant influence on the interest that we're paying. Back in 2007, we paid $429 billion of interest on a $9 trillion debt. In 2013, we only paid $420 on a $17 trillion debt. Why is this so low? Enter the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank has, over the last 5 or 6 years, electronically printed $1.9 trillion and paid down the federal debt and bought bonds and securities. When they did this, they basically didn't charge interest. That drove down the average interest rate on all of our national debt. Back in the days when Bill Clinton was president, 7.1% was the average interest on all of our federal debt. In 2007, it was 4.8%. But as of June of this year, our average interest rate is 1.9% of all the public debt. So we have an artificially low interest rate. So we have to ask the question, what would the interest payment have been in 2013 if the interest rate would have been the same back in 2007? $800 billion. So, guess what? They plan to borrow some more money over into the year 2020. There will be no money available from Social Security to help finance this because we will not only have no surpluses, but beginning in 2015, we're going to start repayment of roughly $25 billion, and the next year 50, then next year 75, the next year 150 billion is going to have to come out of the general fund to repay Social Security. So that's going to add to the deficit. We will have to borrow the money to pay back the money we borrowed. Foreign entities are losing interest quite rapidly in loaning us money for a lot of reasons, but one of the principal reasons why is we've been devaluating our currency by the printing by the Federal Reserve. So, whereas 74% of this trillions of dollars going to come from? I don't know. I'm going to skip this because we all know what's wrong with borrowing money. So we have big trouble here. We ask the question, where's that money going to come from? Literally, foreign entities could very well begin to extract what they've loaned to us, not roll over their bonds and notes in 3 to 4 years. And this is principally because we have devalued it. Beginning roughly in 2017, Social Security Fund will no longer have surpluses, and repayment will have to start. Private investors are not going to loan money to the federal government until interest rate rises. The Congressional Budget Office announced in January they believe interest will have to rise to 5% to get private sector investment. If interest goes to 5% on our national debt, by 2019, the interest payment will be $1 trillion. The Federal Reserve Bank quite possibly could become the principal source of funding for the debt. Either that or massive tax increases. And history has taught us that the printing of currency to fund a national government is the last act of a desperate nation. So, what can we do? Well, there's a policy position we could always take, and that is do nothing. We can elect good people to office who will stop spending and borrowing, but that hasn't occurred in the last 50 years. We can riot in the streets like they have in Europe, or we can make it unlawful for Congress to borrow money to fund its annual expenditures through a balanced budget amendment.